Since retaking the House majority, Republicans have made it clear that their priorities are almost exclusively consisting of investigating the Biden administration and yelling about wokeness and gas stoves. But this week, they're taking it one step further by basically trying to turn the Judiciary Committee into part of Donald Trump's own personal legal team. We call it the Bill Barr method. Overnight, Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan requested testimony from two former prosecutors who were previously involved in the investigation into the alleged hush money payments from Donald Trump to Stormy Daniels. Comes after Jordan, along with two other Republican committee chairs, sent a letter to District Attorney Alvin Bragg himself earlier this week demanding that he testify about his investigation. Well, the Manhattan DA's office was not trying to hear that, responding to those requests, calling it a, quote, unprecedented inquiry into a pending local prosecution, which only came after Trump created a false expectation that he would be arrested the next day, and his lawyers reportedly urged you to intervene. In New York speak, that's forget about it. The New York Times is also reporting that Bragg's office told a Jordan aide on a phone call related to potential subpoenas, quote, your committee has no jurisdiction over us. You're wrong. Stop calling us with this BS. NBC News has not confirmed that reporting, but I'm pretty sure it was close. Joining me now is David Jolly, former Republican congressman from Florida and an MSNBC political analyst, one of my favorite people to talk to. David, I'll start with this because all of this has to do with sort of Republicans in general, sort of subordinating the rule of law, ignoring the rule of law. I have to start with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, for America, I believe there's a GoFundMe where you can send her Lunchables and orange slices for her field trip tomorrow to visit insurrectionists who are in jail. And as much as I have checked the internet, I haven't seen any brilliant, searing letters from a Birmingham jail from people who tried to take over this country. But from a symbolic standpoint, what are your thoughts on this? What is the value and purpose of a sitting member of Congress going and visiting people who were actively trying to overthrow the country, and how concerned should we be about the fact that she's making this trip?
Well, look, I would promise I cannot get inside the head of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think what the nation should take from this is that the Republican Party and its leadership supports insurrectionists, is sympathetic to the events of January 6th, and would like all of us to believe that trying to topple democracy 2 years ago was actually just par for the course in today's America. And so call them sympathizers or supporters of the insurrectionists. It is clear where the priorities of Marjorie Taylor Greene align. And I do think, though, you know, why would you do this, right? You would do it because there is a political and electoral reward, which then goes to where today's Republican Party is. I think supporting insurrectionists and supporting a false narrative around January 6th is now baked into the doctrine of the party. And you can see it in Kevin McCarthy. It was just a few weeks ago we were probably analyzing McCarthy as having made a deal with the insurrectionist caucus in the House or being a sympathizer to the Greens, the Gates, and the Boeberts. He's fully part of them. And we've got to get past this chapter where McCarthy was just making a deal and now realize he's one of them. He is the leader of the party, and Kevin McCarthy himself is pro-insurrectionist.
Right. And like I said, the Republicans are now a dime storefront for a terrorist organization called MAGA. There is no separating the two. And the few individuals, most of whom I wouldn't necessarily even agree with ideologically, who stood up against insurrection itself, have all been kicked out of the party. Speaking of Kevin McCarthy, who, again, just a couple months ago we were saying might be one of the weakest speakers that we've seen in recent history, he had a meeting with Ashley Babettes' mother today, who said that her conversation with the speaker was delightful. The meeting between Babettes' mother and the Republican House Speaker took place a day before several Republican members of Congress planned to visit the D.C. jail where a limited number of charged Capitol rioters who have been deemed a danger to the community or who have refused to obey conditions of release are being held. Here's the thing, and David, this is the other question that gets me. Ashley Babbitt died trying to take over this country. That's the truth. She died trying to break into Congress with a lot of other people who wanted to kill members of Congress. She died because the people that our tax money pays for to defend our representatives saw her as an immediate threat and danger. We know Marjorie Taylor Greene is nothing but a clown and an insurrectionist. We know that Kevin McCarthy has sold what semblance of his soul might have been left on a small cracker cookie to these people in order to stay in power. But to visit the mother of someone who the hard right wants to consider to be a martyr, how does that differ in sort of symbolic and danger, especially given that he's Speaker of the House, from just Marjorie Taylor Greene's silly little field trip?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Ashley Babettes Babbitt lost her life trying to penetrate the House of Representatives, and police acted within their due course to prevent that. Her mother is a grieving mother. We can give her some license. But when it comes to Kevin McCarthy, understand what Republicans are doing to the mother of Ashley Babbitt, as well as other insurrectionists. They are providing an audience that they did not provide to the parents of Parkland victims. Think about that. In terms of how that looks for the priorities of today's Republican Party, they are meeting with empathizers and sympathizers of the insurrection, but they refuse to actually meet with family members of actual gun violence in the United States. And this is where, again, I really think we have to leap past giving Kevin McCarthy this notion that he's just weak. He is absolutely weak. But he is substantively with the insurrectionists now. And so we can evaluate him as a weak speaker, but we also get to evaluate his moral judgment in these matters. And what it shows is he's putting insurrectionists before the country. No question about it.
You know, unarmed black folk get shot in their homes by cops playing video games. They get shot playing with squirt guns outside. I don't see members of Congress running to their aid, running to talk to the mothers of the movement who suffered innumerable losses, and their children weren't trying to break in and murder everybody in the Capitol. You know, David, the other thing that goes with this is we're taking a look now at these tweets from the Judiciary Committee. And the Judiciary Committee, which is now run by Republicans, are tweeting away saying Michael Cohen lied again and again and again, and he went to jail for it, but don't worry. Democrats say you can trust him now. Alvin Bragg should focus on prosecuting national criminals in New York City. The Manhattan DA's case against President Trump is relying in part on matters stemming from the Mueller investigation. Democrats will never get that up. Look, I've seen a Twitter handle occasionally become unhinged. It's happened more and more since Elon Musk took over. But I can't remember the last time that I saw a federal government congressional committee Twitter handle be turned into basically a slam book. Now, historically, we all know, assuming the history is written by the right people, that they'll be looked back poorly on this. But I also think, is it possible that when you're making these kinds of tweets from the committee Twitter handle, this could be part of an investigation down the road? If there are any questions about your partisanship or your ethics, this could be evidence.
Absolutely. First of all, it reflects the House is no longer a serious institution under Republican control. The committee is not a serious committee under Jim Jordan's chairmanship. But this is absolutely part of their interference with an active criminal investigation and prosecutorial grand jury decision. We learned from the New York Times that it was a month ago that Trump's attorneys asked Jim Jordan, please interfere in the Alvin Bragg matter. And now we're seeing that Jim Jordan and Comer and others, under the blessing of Kevin McCarthy, said, OK, Mr. President, we're going to interfere. Which begs the question, what else has Trump asked them to do to interfere in his prosecution around events? This is raw political political interference. And look, when we look at the decision of Bragg to perhaps delay some of these decisions, we take it as though just routine, that maybe there are other matters. One of the things he has to deal with is this matter. This interference. It takes time for an office to parse through this type of interference to make sure they're getting their matters exactly right before the grand jury, if they are indeed to move forward.
From a purely political standpoint, I've often said that when Republicans are engaging in this kind of behavior, Democrats should sit back and let them engage in a circular firing squad. But I do think there's a danger that if all the conversation over the last week and a half has been what Republicans think, what Republicans want to do, how they're trying to defend Trump, they end up controlling the narrative. What would you suggest that the Democratic Party leadership be doing right now while we're having these conversations?
It's a great question. First and foremost, do not interfere in Bragg's prosecutorial decision. He may or may not put this before the grand jury, and who knows what the grand jury will do. That's why you're seeing the White House not opine on it. House Democrats don't need to opine on the subject matter. What they do is laser focus on the Republican malfeasance and their abdication of the actual integrity and responsibility of the House of Representatives. Nail them to the wall on that. And I would suggest this comes to outside groups as well, because the White House is doing the right thing. They're focusing on doing the work of the American people. House Democrats are as well. But there must be scrutiny and consequences for what House Republicans are doing under Kevin McCarthy, Jim Jordan, James Comer, and all the other circus participants we get to witness on a daily basis.
David Jolly, thank you so much for joining us tonight on the ReidOut.